I'm Meg.
And I'm Liam. Welcome to Mars and Bars. Tonight we focus on New Zealand's greatest tragedies, the sinking of the WAHINE.
On the morning of the 10th of April 1968, after an overnight voyage from Lyttelton, the ferry WAHINE encountered a violent southerly storm while entering the Wellington harbour. Winds gusted up to 160 kilometres per hour, and with passengers terrified and feeling very ill indeed, the captain and his crew attempted to get their ship back on course and out of danger. However, battered by the huge waves of the storm, the WAHINE ran aground on Barrett's Reef in Wellington's harbour. Passengers and crew were forced to abandon ship and were flung out into the rough seas of the harbour in life rafts, and had to make the perilous crossing to Wellington's rocky shores, where they were met by locals desperate to help. These rescuers could see the state of the harbour and understand how dangerous the situation had become, perhaps even before those on board had realised. Here is our Wellington correspondent Scarlett Greaves with the original report from that terrible morning in 1968.
Hi and hello everybody, and welcome to Wellington Harbour. I'm here with Jack, who is one of the courageous people that tried to save the WAHINE victims. Thank you for joining us today. You must be exhausted. So Jack, how did you realise that something was wrong?
I live close to the harbour by Seatoon foreshore, and when I was looking out my bedroom window, I saw that there was a ship that was slightly tilted on its side. I then realised that it was sinking, and I really wanted to help, so I got my boat out of the shed and went out to the harbour.
Wow, did you know anyone who was on the boat?
My 25-year-old son Leo was on board, and I was very worried because he never learnt how to swim properly when he was younger.
Did he survive?
Yes, he did, but he was unconscious and had a broken arm. When I first saw him in the water, I couldn't believe my luck that I'd found my son. But then, when I got him onto my boat, I realised that he was unconscious. Only I thought he was dead at this point. I was very upset, but then after 2 minutes, he woke up.
I am aware that there were 610 passengers and 125 crew on the boat. How many did you save?
I saved my son and 6 other people. Some of them jumped off the ship while others were in the water.
Amazing. 7 people. That is incredible. We are currently unaware of how many people died. Oh, wait, we just got in. That 51 people died in this tragic accident.
Yes, it was very tragic. When I got to the shore, the 7 survivors and I saw loads of dead bodies. It was very gruesome.
Now, you have described what it looked like, but how did it feel, having to save some, but not being able to save all? It must have been a truly horrible sight.
It was horrific. I felt like those people that died could have had family waiting at home, just like how I was waiting for my son. I give empathy to those families.
So do I, and I'm sure everyone at home does too. The accident sounds just shocking. Do you have anything else to add?
I'm just glad that my son is okay and the disaster has now ended. And I'm glad that all the survivors are now safe at home. And I also have sympathy for all the ones who lost loved ones in this horrible disaster.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for people for listening and giving your time to remember those who died in this tragic accident. Signing off on this very sad day in New Zealand history. Back to you, Liam, in the studio.
And now, putting the tragedy in the context of its time, here is Life in 1968 Evie, with a look at life in New Zealand in 1968.
New Zealand in 1968 was a quiet place boasting around 2.7 million citizens. Back then, a bottle of milk cost 4 cents, a loaf of bread was 11 cents, the average wage in New Zealand was $2,000 a year, and a ticket on the ill-fated WAHINE cost $6.50. Of course, back then there was no internet and the country had only 2 television channels. This was the year the Beatles released the White Album, while in New Zealand, John Rawls cracked the UK top 10 with If Only I Had the Time and Now Is the Hour. 1968 was the year Will Smith and the Wolverine Hugh Jackman were born. It was also the year the original Planet of the Apes were released, and Mission Impossible and Batman were television programs. Things have certainly changed a lot since back then. Back to you, Megan and Liam.
Those unfortunate enough to be on the WAHINE on the 10th of April 1968 had a very rough crossing. Many of those on board were throwing up continuously due to extremely rough seas. Passengers were told that the storm would pass and to hold on tight. Most thought this was a typical Wellington southerly and assumed that the Wahine would ride it out. However, at 6:41 a.m., the Wahine was carried onto the rocks of Barrett Reef, sustaining serious damage to her hull. The starboard and port, all at right and left, engines stopped working. Anchors were dropped, but it was some time before they held firm, while rescue attempts from the shore were made impossible by the raging gales and massive swells. By early afternoon, all 734 passengers and crew were ordered to abandon ship and get into the life rafts, but only half of the 8 life rafts could be used because of the steep angle of the now sinking ship. Of the 734 people on the ship, 51 lost their lives. In 1968, reporter Georgia Robinson talked to the survivors from the tragedy. Let's roll that footage now.
Hello from the windy Wellington coast. I am here with Oliver Jeffrey, a survivor from the WAHINE. So, Oliver, can you describe what happened to you on board?
Started rocking and then it stayed on an angle on one side. People were screaming and running everywhere, trying to get to the life rafts, and then the captain on the speaker said, "Everyone calm down and go to the lifeboats." Suddenly the boat hit a swell and I was thrown overboard.
What was the weather like out there? Was the water cold?
It was freezing cold and a wild storm. There were many people around me. Most of them didn't make it, and some drowned and some died of hypothermia.
How did you survive?
As soon as I hit the water, I started swimming. But since I can't swim very well, I gave up, and slowly the waves brought me to the shore. When I reached the shore, there were a couple that brought me to the beach house and gave me soup and towels to get me warm. They drove me to hospital in a truck and I was diagnosed with mild hypothermia.
Was there anyone on board that you knew?
Well, yes, it was a very sad day because my brother was on board. Unfortunately, he didn't make it out. But there was this kid that I played with in the corridor. He survived, but was confined to hospital.
What went through your head when you were bobbing through the waves?
Well, I thought about my mother being left alone if I die, but mostly cold and am I gonna die?
Are you going to do anything to memorialize your brother and the other deceased?
Of course, I'm going to a service in town with my mother. I'm also going to visit the little boy in hospital I told you about.
Well, there you have it, New Zealand, a survivor's report on what happened on the WAHINE. Thank you for speaking to me, Oliver. Back to you in the studio.
A fascinating piece of New Zealand history. And now, let us look at the human error being the possible reason for the sinking of the WAHINE. Captain Elliot Brooke had been master of the ill-fated ferry for some time, and had sailed to and from Wellington numerous times in strong winds and high seas. He was an experienced captain. It was Captain Brooke's decision to enter the harbour when they did. The ferry was 20 minutes behind schedule when freak gusts of 100 knots or more struck the vessel and put it out of line. In 1968, the captain was quoted as saying, "If those winds had struck 5 minutes later, we would have been through the entrance and could have come down the harbour. We could have dropped anchor in Oriental Bay, where it was quite calm." Some people suggested that Captain Brooke was too late in his decision to put the passengers into the life rafts, and they should have been evacuated much earlier. Captain Brooke, however, feels he made the right decision, saying, "People who say that don't know what they are talking about. If I had put them off any earlier, everyone would have been lost. I would have had 600 lives on my conscience." We now go to an interview given by crew member Captain Elliot Brooke 4 years after the disaster in 1972. This interview may give us some insight as to what was happening on the bridge that day.
How did you feel? I'm Charlotte, and joining me now is Captain Robinson, the captain of the WAHINE. How did you feel seeing everybody struggle to survive?
It was a hard thing to experience because people were rushing towards the life rafts like mice after peanut butter.
When did you first start to notice the weather changing?
The boat was on such an angle that people were sliding down the deck because of the amount of water that was splashing over the side of the boat. It was difficult to see the sky from the front of the ship because the front windscreen was built to watch the sea. We did, however, get some warnings about a storm brewing and a strong northerlies and severe tropical depression.
How did the ship sink?
We ran into trouble at Barrett Reef in Wellington Harbour. We struck the underwater surface and sadly capsized. From what I have heard, 51 innocent people have died. To all that have lost relatives to this horrendous disaster, you have my condolences.
What did you feel as you watched the ship sink?
I felt horrified at the scale of this disaster and shocked that it had happened. It was so fast and there were so many people screaming and crying. It was the worst experience I've ever had.
Thank you for your time, Captain Robinson. Back to you in the studio.
Fascinating old footage there. Now Melissa and Evie will analyse the weather on the 10th of April 1968. It certainly was a terrible day to be stuck outside New Zealand.
Early on the 9th of April 1968, Cyclone Giselle hit Cape Reinga. Winds of up to 160 kilometres an hour caused massive damage to buildings, and torrential rain flooded farmland in Northland, drowning hundreds of farm animals. A farmer was also killed when he was blown off a haystack. The cyclone's patterns of damage continue as it travelled across the North Island and turned down the east coast. Ships were driven ashore and landslips closed roads. Rain caused massive flooding and wind left roofs torn off and broken windows. By the time Cyclone Giselle hit Wellington on the morning of the 10th of April, another storm had driven up the west coast of the South Island from Antarctica. The two storms met over the capital, causing huge damage. Winds in Wellington were the strongest ever recorded, at one point reaching speeds of 275 kilometres an hour.
As the storm moved on to the South Island, hundreds of Christchurch homes lost their roofs, and over 500 hectares of Canterbury forest were destroyed. In Southland, the flooding was the worst since 1913. Some people were stranded on the roofs of their houses and had to be rescued by jet boat. Cyclone Giselle finally blew out somewhere in the Southern Ocean, and there you have it, folks. Perhaps if weather forecasting could have been then what it is now, the WAHINE disaster would never have happened. Back to you, Meg and Liam.
Thanks, Melissa and Evie. Well, that's all we have time for this evening. We hope you have learned something about your country's history and about one of our darkest days.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again until next time. Until then, I'm Meg.
And I'm Liam for Marsden Bars. Goodbye.
And ka kate ano.